The grand ballroom was filled with glimmering chandeliers, laughter, and the sound of glasses clinking as the city's elite gathered for another extravagant celebration. Amidst the crowd, Jonathan Thorne, a towering figure in the business world, strode confidently into the room. Dressed in a tailored suit, his sharp features set in a smug smile, he felt invincible. His mistress, a young, striking woman, walked beside him, eyes gleaming with admiration, their hands clasped together as they made their way to the heart of the party. Jonathan's ego was at its peak. His company was thriving, his power undeniable, and his personal life, a carefully curated masterpiece. He reveled in the attention, his gaze sweeping across the room with a sense of superiority. His laughter echoed in the space, as though the entire evening was merely an extension of his own success. But then, the world around him seemed to stop. His eyes locked onto a figure standing near the far side of the room. It was her. His ex-wife. Her presence was undeniable, even in a room full of glittering jewels and high society. The years had been kind to her, her beauty had only deepened, her confidence soaring. She wasn't just standing there, she was owning the space around her, effortlessly commanding attention. The same woman who had once loved him, once believed in him, was now a complete stranger. For a moment, Jonathan felt as if the air had been knocked from his lungs. He couldn't tear his gaze away. His mind raced, what was she doing here? How had she remained so stunning, so untouchable, even after everything that had happened? He felt a pang in his chest, something unfamiliar. Could it be regret? His smile faltered for just a second, but it didn't last long. His pride quickly masked it. After all, he was Jonathan Thorne, nothing and no one could shake his confidence. But as he watched her interact with the others in the room, the cracks in his self-assurance began to show. She wasn't just beautiful, she was flourishing. And he? He was just another man, another success story. The weight of their past, the divorce, the bitterness, the neglect, seemed like a distant memory. But for Jonathan, seeing her again after all these years stirred something deep within him. Why was he feeling this way? And why now? He was here with a beautiful woman, he had everything he could possibly need, yet in the presence of his ex-wife, he felt something he couldn't quite define. Maybe, just maybe, he was about to realize that all the success in the world couldn't replace the one thing he had lost, her. The room suddenly felt smaller, the laughter louder, but all Jonathan could hear was the sound of his own heartbeat. His ex-wife had entered his life again, and he had no idea how it would change everything. As the party continued around him, Jonathan remained fixated on his ex-wife, Olivia. She seemed so at ease, so confident in her own skin, and he couldn't shake the sense of awe he felt. It had been years since they last saw each other, 7 to be exact, but it felt like a lifetime. He took a deep breath, trying to push aside the feelings swirling inside him. He turned back to his mistress, but the brief encounter with Olivia lingered in his mind. He could still see her face, the way her eyes met his, as though nothing had ever happened between them. A flashback to the beginning. Their story had once been so full of promise. Jonathan and Olivia had met in their 20s, both driven, both ambitious. Olivia was a talented artist, someone with a spark that could light up any room, but Jonathan had fallen in love with her for more than just her beauty. Her kindness, her compassion, her ability to see the world beyond the material, all these things drew him in. In the early years of their marriage, they had been inseparable. They were a team, each pushing the other to achieve more. Jonathan had been building his business empire, and Olivia was there every step of the way, supporting him, encouraging him, helping him navigate the highs and lows of the journey. But then, something changed. As Jonathan's business grew, so did his ego. The more power he gained, the more he craved it. He began to spend long hours at the office, neglecting Olivia and the life they had built together. His focus shifted away from her, and in its place, there was only his ambition. Olivia, once his partner in everything, found herself growing more and more isolated. Their once vibrant home became a place of silence. Olivia would wait for him to come home, but he would often arrive late, distracted, consumed by the endless demands of his growing empire. She tried to reach out, tried to remind him of the love they had shared, but Jonathan was too consumed by his own success to notice. He didn't see how his absence was eating away at her heart. And then came the day she walked away. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't filled with shouting or anger. It was a quiet realization for Olivia that their love had faded, replaced by the distance Jonathan had created. She had asked him to choose, her or his empire. He had chosen the empire, and in that moment, Olivia knew there was nothing left for them. Jonathan had been blindsided. For a man who had built his entire life on control and dominance, he had no idea how to fight for her. And so, Olivia left. She packed up her things, and without a word, she was gone. The divorce was quick. It was as if they were strangers, both trying to forget the love they had once shared. Jonathan had tried to move on, but nothing felt the same. His wealth, his success, they meant nothing without Olivia by his side. But by then, it was too late. She was gone. Back to the present. As he stood there in the ballroom, watching Olivia from across the room, Jonathan felt something that he hadn't felt in years: regret. It was a hollow, aching feeling in the pit of his stomach. He had been so sure of himself, so certain that he could have everything. But in that moment, he realized that all the money in the world could never bring her back. Olivia had always been more than he had given her credit for. She wasn't just the woman behind the man, she had been his equal, his partner. And now, as he watched her talk to the other guests with ease, he saw the life she had built without him. A life that didn't need his approval, didn't need his success to define it. Jonathan had thought he was untouchable. But in that moment, seeing Olivia again, he realized he had lost everything that truly mattered. The distance between them felt wider now, and for the first time, Jonathan wondered if it was even possible to close that gap. As the evening progressed, Jonathan could no longer ignore the whirlwind of emotions that had been swirling within him since his eyes first met Olivia's. He had come to this party feeling on top of the world, believing his success, wealth, and control over his empire made him untouchable. Yet now, in her presence, his confidence felt fragile, almost pathetic. His mistress, still at his side, noticed the change in his demeanor. She had been talking to him, laughing at his jokes, but her voice faded into the background as Jonathan's focus remained fixed on Olivia. It seemed as though the entire world had shrunk down to just the two of them. For a fleeting moment, Jonathan imagined walking over to Olivia, striking up a conversation, perhaps even rekindling the connection they once had. He imagined taking her hand again, her gentle smile greeting him as if nothing had ever changed. But as soon as he entertained the thought, he felt a wave of dread wash over him. He wasn't the man he used to be, the man Olivia had fallen in love with. Back then, he had been a man with dreams, with a vision, and with a heart. Now, all he had was power and prestige, but they had come at the cost of everything that had once made him human. He watched her laugh with others at the party, and it struck him how effortless it seemed for her. Olivia wasn't just charming and elegant, she was whole, content, and, most importantly, free from the suffocating grip of his ambition. She had found her own way in the world. Jonathan hadn't just lost his wife, he had lost the person who had kept him grounded, the one who had loved him unconditionally, the one who believed in him when no one else did. His attempt to regain his composure faltered. There was no way to win her back now, not with words, not with gifts, and certainly not with his wealth. The realization hit him hard: the man he had become was someone Olivia could never return to. She had moved on, and he had no one but himself to blame. But Jonathan wasn't ready to admit defeat just yet. His arrogance flared, the same arrogance that had caused the rift in the first place. He turned to his mistress, forcing a smile as he gestured for her to follow him toward the bar. "I'll be right back," he said, his voice barely audible over the chatter of the crowd. But his mind was already elsewhere. The urge to regain control over the situation was almost unbearable. What if he could still fix things? What if there was a way to make Olivia see him the way she once had? At the bar, he ordered a drink, his hands slightly shaking. He was trying to convince himself that it didn't matter, that he didn't need Olivia anymore. But deep inside, he knew it wasn't true. No amount of money, no glamorous party, no beautiful woman by his side could fill the emptiness he felt in her absence. He turned back toward Olivia, only to see her looking directly at him. Her eyes locked onto his for a moment, and there was something in them, something that made Jonathan's heart race. Was it pity? Was it indifference? He couldn't tell, but it didn't matter. The damage had already been done. Olivia looked away, turning back to the conversation she had been having before. She didn't need him, and for the first time in his life, Jonathan understood what that felt like. The night dragged on, but Jonathan's mind was elsewhere. As he watched Olivia interact with the guests, he could see the life she had built without him. A life full of purpose, joy, and peace. And as much as he hated to admit it, he knew deep down that he would never have that life back, not as long as he clung to the man he had become. As Jonathan stood there, nursing his drink, he couldn't stop thinking about Olivia. The longer he watched her, the more he realized how much she had transformed. In all their years together, Olivia had always been quiet in her strength, never seeking the spotlight or accolades. She had been his anchor, always there, always patient, always understanding. But now, the woman before him was a revelation. She was no longer the woman he had married. The one who had waited for him to come home after long days at the office, the one who had patiently listened to his endless talk of business deals and corporate strategy. No, the woman before him was confident, vibrant, and completely at ease in her own skin. She wasn't looking for his approval or validation anymore. She didn't need it. And that stung more than Jonathan cared to admit. Her smile was genuine as she spoke to the guests, her voice warm and welcoming. She had an ease about her, a natural grace that Jonathan hadn't seen in years. He had always been proud of her beauty, but now, seeing her so self-assured, so independent, he understood something deeper. Olivia had grown into her own person. She had become someone remarkable, someone who didn't rely on the success of her husband, or ex-husband, to define her worth. Jonathan watched as Olivia effortlessly moved through the room, exchanging pleasantries with other guests, her laughter filling the space around her. He couldn't help but feel the contrast. He was surrounded by people, but in that moment, he felt more alone than ever. He looked down at the woman beside him, his mistress, but it was as if she didn't exist. His focus was entirely on Olivia. The transformation. It wasn't just Olivia's appearance that had changed, it was her entire aura. Jonathan had always known she was talented, but he hadn't realized just how much potential she had. Over the years since their divorce, Olivia had carved out a life for herself that was beyond what he ever could have imagined. She had built a thriving art gallery, one that had gained recognition in the art world. She was known not just for her beauty, but for her intellect, her artistic eye, and her ability to connect with people. Jonathan had read about her success in the newspapers, of course. He had tried to dismiss it, telling himself that her accomplishments didn't matter to him, that they didn't affect him. But now, seeing her in person, it hit him harder than he had anticipated. She had done it all without him. In those early years, Jonathan had been the one who had pushed her to pursue her passions. He had always encouraged her to follow her dreams, but it had been a different kind of encouragement, one that had been rooted in his own ambition. He wanted her to be successful, yes, but only if it reflected well on him, only if it fit into the image of the power couple they were supposed to be. But Olivia had been stronger than that. She had found her own way, and it didn't revolve around him. As Jonathan continued to watch her, he realized just how much he had taken her for granted. He had thought that she would always be there, waiting in the background while he focused on his career. But she had refused to be his accessory. She had left when she realized that she deserved more than the scraps of attention he was willing to offer. And now, she was thriving without him. The weight of regret. A sharp pang of regret struck Jonathan, as though a fist had clenched around his chest. He had always been focused on building his empire, on expanding his wealth and power, but now it felt empty. What had he really gained? He had lost the love of his life, the person who had believed in him even when he hadn't believed in himself. The mistress at his side shifted, trying to engage him in conversation, but Jonathan barely heard her. His eyes were locked on Olivia, who now stood near the window, speaking with another guest. For the first time, he realized that the life he had been living, full of wealth and prestige, was nothing without the human connections that truly mattered. His heart clenched as he thought of the moments they had once shared. The quiet nights spent talking over dinner, the laughter that had filled their home, the warmth that had come from knowing they were building a future together. But that future had crumbled under the weight of his own neglect. As Jonathan's thoughts spiraled, the moment of clarity struck him with devastating force. Olivia had moved on, not just from their marriage, but from the man he had become. She had built something for herself, something that didn't need him. And no matter how much he wished he could turn back time, no matter how much he longed for the past, the truth was undeniable. Olivia had become the woman she was always meant to be, and she no longer needed him to complete her. Jonathan stood frozen, a prisoner to his own regret, watching Olivia with a mixture of admiration and loss. But in his heart, he knew he had lost more than just her. He had lost the chance to be the man he once was, the man who had deserved her love. The night stretched on, the music flowing through the grand hall like a river, but Jonathan felt as though he was drowning. Every laugh, every word exchanged between Olivia and the guests, seemed to echo in his ears, a constant reminder of the life he had lost. He glanced at his mistress, her excitement over their glamorous evening seeming like an afterthought. She was talking to someone nearby, but Jonathan wasn't listening. He was thinking about the conversation he had overheard earlier, a passing comment from one of the partygoers about Olivia's latest exhibition. They had called it groundbreaking and powerful. The words cut through Jonathan's thoughts like shards of glass. He had never truly understood the depth of Olivia's talent or the way she had connected with the world around her. He had always dismissed it as just a hobby, something secondary to the life they were supposed to build together. But now, with the distance of years between them, he saw it differently. Olivia wasn't just an artist, she was a force in her own right. A woman who had built a legacy, a name for herself, and who had done so without him. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. He had always believed he was the reason for their success, his drive, his ambition had made them powerful together. But now he knew the truth, it wasn't just him. It was Olivia's quiet strength, her resilience, her unwavering belief in herself, even when he had failed her. The tension grows. Jonathan's mind spun with this truth as he found himself standing by the bar, staring into his drink. His mistress approached, her voice snapping him back to reality. "Jonathan, are you okay?" she asked, her tone laced with concern, or perhaps annoyance. It was clear she had noticed his distracted behavior, his distance. But Jonathan barely heard her. His thoughts were elsewhere, fixated on Olivia. He saw her now, laughing with a group of guests, the same laughter that once filled their home. But this time, it wasn't for him. She wasn't laughing because of his jokes, his charm, or his success. She was laughing because she was happy, genuinely happy. And that stung more than he was willing to admit. As he tried to refocus, his mind drifted to the last conversation he had with Olivia before their divorce. It had been civil, too civil, really. Olivia had been quiet, as though she had already accepted the inevitable. But Jonathan, consumed by his own pride, hadn't realized just how much she had already given up. He hadn't seen that she was already living in a world without him, a world in which he didn't matter. He had thought she would wait for him to come around, but he had been wrong. She had let go long before he had. He had made his mistake long before the divorce papers were signed. It wasn't the neglect, or the late nights, or the endless work that had driven her away. It was his inability to see her as an equal. His belief that he could control everything, that his success would be enough to hold her, and their life, together. He had been blinded by his own ambition, believing that all he needed was to rise higher in the world, and that she would always be there to support him. But in his pursuit of more, he had lost the one thing that mattered most. His obsession with success, with building his empire, had come at the cost of their love. And now, looking at Olivia across the room, he could see how far he had fallen. The mistress's disappointment. As Jonathan's thoughts spiraled, the distance between him and his mistress grew. She had been so eager to accompany him to the party, to bask in the glow of his success. But now, she was noticing the way his attention was drifting, how his eyes were constantly on Olivia. She could see the shift in his demeanor, the way his pride was giving way to something softer, something less certain. Her patience was wearing thin. She had always known Jonathan to be a man who controlled his emotions, a man who never let anyone see him vulnerable. But now, there was something different about him. She could see the cracks beginning to form in his armor. "Jonathan," she said again, her voice cutting through his thoughts, "what's going on? You've barely said 2 words to me tonight." Jonathan didn't answer immediately. His eyes were still locked on Olivia, his mind replaying the countless times he had pushed her away. And then, a realization so clear and sharp that it almost hurt: he had never truly seen her. He had always seen her as a complement to his life, a woman who supported him, who made his world look good. But she had never needed him to make her world complete. She had always been enough on her own. He turned to his mistress, the weight of his mistake heavy in his chest. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, the words foreign to his lips. But they felt true, the first honest thing he had said in years. She stared at him, her face hardening. "You're sorry?" she echoed, disbelief in her voice. "For what?" Jonathan swallowed, unable to meet her gaze. "For everything. For taking her for granted. For thinking I could have it all without losing what mattered most." His mistress took a step back, her face unreadable. "I didn't come here to watch you have a breakdown over your ex-wife. I came here for you." Jonathan closed his eyes, his heart sinking. He knew he had lost her, just as he had lost Olivia. The realization was both liberating and crushing. He had thought he was in control of everything, that his life was perfect. But in the end, he had built a house of cards that had come crashing down. The weight of his regret. The night dragged on, but Jonathan's world had already shifted. He could no longer ignore the weight of his actions, the consequences of his choices. Olivia had moved on, and he couldn't blame her. He had neglected her, rejected her love, and in doing so, had lost the most important thing in his life. And now, as he watched her from across the room, he knew that it was too late to fix it. No words, no gestures, no grand apologies could undo the hurt he had caused. The only thing left for Jonathan was to confront the truth, that he had failed. And in that failure, he would have to find a way to rebuild, not just his life, but himself. The night seemed to stretch on forever as Jonathan moved through the party in a fog, his mind replaying his regrets over and over again. He could hear the laughter of the guests, the clinking of glasses, but everything felt distant, hollow, even. His thoughts kept drifting back to Olivia, to the woman who had been his equal, his partner in everything, only to be abandoned when his ambition and pride had taken center stage. He tried to shake the thoughts from his mind, but they clung to him, suffocating him, pulling him deeper into a well of self-reflection. The mansion, once a symbol of everything he had built, now felt like a prison. He couldn't escape the feeling that he had lost something irreplaceable. And all the wealth in the world, all the power he had accumulated, couldn't bring it back. His mistress was no longer by his side. She had slipped away, perhaps in search of more entertaining company. Jonathan wasn't surprised. He had neglected her, just as he had neglected Olivia. In a strange way, he felt a sense of relief. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't pretending anymore. The facade of success and power he had spent years constructing had crumbled, leaving him raw and exposed. Jonathan stepped out onto the terrace, the cool night air brushing against his skin. The party inside seemed to be a world away. He leaned against the railing, staring out at the city lights below, his thoughts spiraling. For the first time, he allowed himself to truly feel the weight of his choices. He thought about the years he had spent chasing success, years spent ignoring the person who had loved him the most, the person who had believed in him when no one else had. And in doing so, he had driven her away. A long overdue apology. He took a deep breath, his chest tightening with emotion. He hadn't allowed himself to feel any of this before. He had always been too focused on what came next, too wrapped up in the pursuit of more. More money. More power. More recognition. But now, standing alone on the terrace, he understood the truth. All of it had been meaningless. Jonathan thought back to that final conversation with Olivia, the one before the divorce. He had been so blind, so sure that he could keep her by his side, that he could keep her waiting for him to get his priorities straight. He had taken her for granted. He had never once considered what it might feel like for her to watch him prioritize everything else in his life but her. He had never once asked her how she felt, what she needed, what she dreamed of beyond their marriage. And now, it was too late. Olivia had moved on. She had found happiness without him. And he had lost the chance to make things right. But as he stood there, a thought struck him. It wasn't too late to change. He couldn't go back and undo the damage, but maybe, just maybe, he could start anew. Not with Olivia. That chapter had closed. But with himself. With his own life. He had spent so much time focusing on external achievements, on building his empire, on maintaining his position at the top of the food chain, that he had forgotten to look inward. And now, as he felt the cool night air against his skin, he realized that it was time to rebuild, not just his career, but his character. He needed to rediscover who he was beneath the layers of pride and arrogance. He needed to face the man he had become and do the hard work of becoming someone better. A moment of peace. Jonathan closed his eyes and took a deep breath. The city lights below shimmered like stars, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of peace. It wasn't the peace that came from success or admiration, it was a deeper kind of peace. A peace born from accepting responsibility for his actions and understanding that the road to redemption began with one simple step, acknowledging his mistakes. He had no illusions that he could ever regain what he had lost. Olivia would never return to him, not in the same way. But he could change. He could start taking accountability for his actions, for the people he had hurt along the way, and for the relationships he had neglected. And, maybe, just maybe, he could learn to love himself again, not in the way he had before, but in a healthier, more honest way. As he stood there, looking out at the city, Jonathan realized that this moment, this quiet, painful clarity, was the first step on the long road ahead. The journey to becoming a better man would not be easy, but it would be worth it. For the first time in years, Jonathan felt ready to begin. A new beginning. With a deep, steadying breath, Jonathan stood up straighter. He was no longer the arrogant CEO who had built his empire on the backs of others. He was no longer the man who had lost the love of his life due to his own pride. He was a man at a crossroads, a man who had faced the consequences of his actions and was ready to change. The night wasn't over, but for Jonathan, the party had already faded into the background. What mattered now wasn't the success he had built. What mattered now was the work he had to do to rebuild himself. And it would start with the first step, facing the man he had been and committing to becoming the man he could be. The following weeks passed in a blur, the world around Jonathan moving forward as his life stood still. He had retreated from the spotlight, choosing instead to focus on the deep, internal work that he had put off for so long. It wasn't easy. He spent days reflecting on his actions, his past, and the painful truth that had taken him so long to face. But for the first time in years, he was not running from the truth, he was confronting it head-on. Jonathan had reached out to a counselor to help guide him through the process of change. He knew he couldn't do it alone. He needed to rediscover the man he had once been, the man who had been capable of love, of kindness, of true connection. He wasn't sure if he would ever be the man he was before, but he was determined to try. And with each passing day, Jonathan found himself shedding the layers of arrogance and pride that had once defined him. It wasn't a quick fix. It wasn't a dramatic transformation. It was a slow, painful process of recognizing his flaws and working tirelessly to correct them. But every small step forward felt like a victory. An unexpected encounter. One evening, months after the party, Jonathan found himself at a small art gallery, one that Olivia had been known to frequent. He had hesitated at first, unsure if it was the right time, but something inside him urged him to go. He wanted to see the world through Olivia's eyes, to understand the life she had built without him. More than that, he wanted to understand himself, to see if he could truly change. As he walked through the gallery, admiring the art on the walls, a familiar voice caught his attention. He turned around, his heart racing, and there she was, Olivia. She looked as stunning as ever, but there was something different about her now, something more serene, more at peace. She was no longer the woman he had tried to control. She had become her own person, a woman who had found happiness on her own terms. Jonathan approached her slowly, unsure of what to say, but determined to speak honestly. "Olivia," he said, his voice quieter than usual. "I never thought I'd see you here." Olivia turned to him, her expression neutral but not cold. There was a moment of silence between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was as though the years had created a space where neither of them needed to fill the silence with words. They simply stood there, two people who had once shared a life, now standing apart but still connected by their past. "I didn't expect to see you here either," Olivia replied, her voice warm but distant. "But it's good to see you." Jonathan nodded, unsure of how to proceed. He had no expectations, no illusions that things could return to how they once were. He had no right to ask for that. But there was something in her eyes that made him want to try to show her that he had changed, that he was a different man than the one who had failed her years ago. "I've been thinking a lot about everything, about us," Jonathan began, his words hesitant but genuine. "I've spent so long chasing things that don't matter, things that I thought would make me happy. But I realize now that none of that means anything without the people who truly matter. I took you for granted, and I'm sorry. I was selfish, and I didn't appreciate what I had until it was gone." Olivia looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Jonathan's heart pounded in his chest. He wasn't sure what she was thinking, but he could see the years of hurt in her eyes. She had moved on, and he couldn't expect her to forgive him overnight. But there was a quiet dignity about her that told him she had already forgiven him in her own way. "I'm glad you found clarity," Olivia finally said, her voice calm but firm. "It's not easy, what you've gone through. But you've made a start, Jonathan. That's what matters." Jonathan swallowed hard, the weight of her words settling deep within him. "I don't expect anything from you. I know I can't go back and fix the past. But I just want you to know that I'm trying. I'm trying to be a better person." Olivia smiled softly, a small, knowing smile that reached her eyes. "I believe you," she said. "And I hope you keep trying. For yourself." Jonathan felt something inside him shift. It wasn't closure, he didn't need that. He didn't need to rekindle their past or fix their broken relationship. What mattered was that he had taken responsibility for his mistakes, that he had finally faced the man he had been, and now he had the chance to rebuild himself into someone better. Olivia had always believed in his potential. And now, for the first time, he believed in it too. The true lesson. As they parted ways that evening, Jonathan felt a strange sense of peace. The future was still uncertain, and there were no guarantees. But he knew now that change was possible. He had spent so many years consumed by his pride and ambition, thinking that they were the keys to happiness. But they were empty, hollow pursuits. The true key to happiness lay in understanding, in humility, and in the willingness to grow. Jonathan didn't know what would come next, but he did know one thing: he was no longer the arrogant man he once was. He had learned, the hard way, that true success wasn't measured by money, power, or status. It was measured by the relationships you build, the love you give, and the strength it takes to be vulnerable, to admit when you've been wrong, and to strive for something better. He was a work in progress, and that was okay. Because for the first time in years, Jonathan felt like he was finally on the right path.